of inquiry into slavery and racism at universities and campuses. My name's Adam Green. I teach in the history department here at the University of Chicago. I'm a member of the More Than Diversity campaign, and I'm honored and thrilled to be welcoming our three panelists to join us today and talk about these processes at their campuses. And I'll go directly into introductions. There will be brief remarks by all three of our panelists and a short moderated discussion followed by questions from the audience. And I will be monitoring the chat so I can take questions there, as well as I think that probably will be the best way to take questions, given that it's difficult to see others who are in the audience on the call. But let me go ahead and introduce our panelists who are here. First, Deborah Gray-White is the Board of Governors Professor of History and Professor of Women and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. She's also the faculty chair of the Committee on Enslaved and Disenfranchised Populations in Rutgers History that was begun in, I believe, 2015 or 2016 and is finishing up its work now. With her is Marisa Fuentes, who is an associate professor and presidential term chair in Women and Gender Studies and History at Rutgers University, also a member of the Committee on Enslaved and Disenfranchised People at Rutgers. And she is the research director for the Scarlet and Black Project, a series of 3 publications that have come out of the work of this committee and involved a number of researchers at Rutgers. And she will talk more about that, as will Deborah Gray-White. And our third panelist is Kirt von Daacke, who is an associate professor of history and assistant dean in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia, and also the co-chair of the President's Commission on Slavery and the University at the University of Virginia. So we're very honored and very thrilled to have the three of them here to speak with us. What I will ask is for each of the panelists to give opening remarks, and then we will have a brief guided conversation and then take questions from those that are attending on the webinar. So perhaps, Deborah, if I could ask you to start, that would be great.
Actually, I'm going to defer to my colleague, Marisa, who's going to first talk about our findings.
Very good.
Thanks, Deborah. It's an honor to be here, an honor to be in conversation with all of you. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about the research and the volumes that came out of one part of the Scarlet and Black Project. And this was an initiative by the Chancellor at the time, and he asked us to do an entire volume on the history of slavery and dispossession at Rutgers. This coincided with the 250th anniversary of the campus. And he asked us to present the research findings we sort of had 8 months, and we presented them at an event at the end of a year of events. So we were tasked with producing a book exploring Rutgers history with Native American dispossession and slavery in the colonial period. And as the first director of research, I worked with Professor White to recruit a group of about 12 graduate students, primarily from the history department, but also from sociology and later the School of Education. And we were able to pay these students to do archival research and write essays that were drawn from material at our own library, special collections, and university archives. And they formulated essays that included information on the early involvement of the founders and faculty of the Dutch Reformed Church's Theological Seminary, later Queen's College, and Queen's College becomes Rutgers University. And the research involved linking these founders and faculty with the dispossession and colonial education of the Lenni Lenape people in the area where the campuses were constructed. The research also highlighted these early founders as slave owners and traders, and uncovered a handful of enslaved people who had worked on building campus structures. Uncovering a connection to Sojourner Truth's family and the name of an enslaved man named Will were crucial to telling previously silent stories about Rutgers' connection to slavery. And then volume 2, which came out of the success of volume 1, we were asked as a surprise to do 2 more volumes, and Deborah can talk about the surprise. So volume 2 explored the period of the Civil War to World War II and covered the racial ideologies in campus curricula, in debates and speeches of pro-slavery students and faculty, as well as tracing the first African Americans that attended the theological seminary, one of whom was a former enslaved man. These early students trained as clergy to then go back and to serve their community's religious needs. Important to all 3 volumes was a focus on the New Brunswick African American community and their efforts to fight slavery, the efforts to fight the American Colonization Society that was supported by Rutgers faculty and trustees. And they also built religious and civic institutions which supported Black community members, enslaved and free. Finally, in the 3rd volume, we covered the period from World War II to the present, focusing on the pioneering generation of Black and Puerto Rican students across all of Rutgers colleges and campuses, including Camden and Newark and their respective law schools. This volume documents Rutgers student activism during the civil rights and Black power movements, and these students' committed struggles for inclusion, Black and Puerto Rican studies programs, college affordability, and their participation in community activism in the surrounding cities. And I'll end just by saying that we had enormous support for this multi-volume project. We had support from other faculty members, one of which is an author in volume 1, and we had support of an extensive and really renowned library staff. We also had talented graduate students who were paid through funds provided by the Chancellor's office. And these students received multiple publication credits and public history experience that have been crucial for them as they enter the professoriate. We were also able to hire, after volume 1, 3 postdocs who directed research for the final 2 volumes and helped to create the Digital Archives website, worked with community members on digitization projects, created campus tours, an app for self-guided tours, as well as offered language and support for historical markers across campus, and also taught classes that integrate this history while teaching students digital public history tools. I'm happy to speak more in detail about any of these volumes in the Q&A, but we'll turn over to my colleague, Professor Deborah Gray-White, who will speak about the broader commission, of which these volumes are one part. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. So the project got started in 2015. I was literally minding my own business when I got a call from the Vice Chancellor, who asked me if I could guess what she was calling about. I didn't have a clue really, but I was soon to find out. 2016 marked the 250th anniversary of the founding of Rutgers University. And after a meeting that Chancellor Richard Edwards had with African-American students who told him about their feelings of alienation on campus, the Chancellor formed a committee that had the unwieldy title of the Committee on the Enslaved and Disenfranchised Populations in Rutgers History. Mind you, the committee was formed and announced before they had a chair. So the Vice Chancellor was calling to ask me if I had seen the announcement, which I said, no, I really hadn't. But she did then proceed to ask me if I would chair the committee. I think that it says a lot, and we can talk about that later. But I'd like to say that there was a lot of planning that went into this project. To be honest, there was more resolve and dogged determination than endless planning, composed of administrators from different areas of the university, undergraduate and graduate representatives. If given the size of this committee, we would have still been meeting today on how to accomplish our goal of uncovering this history. Not the least of the issues was the fact that everyone who had been excluded from Rutgers history wanted to be now included. And that's not a bad thing, but it's impossible to do with one project. Moreover, the history is difficult and time consuming, especially given the nature of 16th and 17th century historical sources, which all are handwritten and in Old English. And for that, I really have to thank my colleague Marisa, who is very schooled in this area of history. So without her help, I really would not have been able to, even I didn't do the research, but she clearly knew where things were and how things had to be done. But I have been given a mandate, and I sometimes call it Mission Impossible. And it was not put exactly in these words, but it was truly like the Mission Impossible movies. So, if you're familiar with them, it's like your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to research, write, edit, and publish a book before the end of the anniversary year 2016. Mind you, we are in November of 2015. If you accept this job, you will present your initial findings at a public forum and have the first volume ready to distribute at that time. Rutgers had the press. We had to provide the manuscript. There's no tape to self-destruct like they have in the movies, okay? No one promised to disavow me or the instructions, but I knew this was a job of colossal proportions. That's something else that I think that we need to discuss, particularly in light of the fact that it is often faculty of color that are given these kinds of missions and jobs. How did we go about it? Actually, I think the time constraint worked in our favor. We had a deadline and we were going to meet it. Remarkably, there was no arguing, there were no disputes. There really was a remarkable pulling together. While I met with the committee on the enslaved, etc., I created a subcommittee of experts. And these experts were archivists, librarians, graduate students, and fellow professors. A team of graduate students from the history department and a grad student from sociology. And I think that's really important. People just showed up. People just showed up to help, and they just volunteered. Professor Fuentes was one of them. Our department Native American expert, Camilla Townsend, she just showed up. Thomas Cruciano, who at the time was a university archivist. They just came and just said, how can I help? Because of the connection between the Dutch Reformed Church and the founding of Rutgers, we also work closely with librarians at the Sage Library of the New Brunswick Theological Seminary. They divided into 3 subgroups. One group worked on the trustees and founders of Rutgers, and they located wills and inventories that indicated who owns which slaves. Again, these were in Rutgers' own archives. We have the names of some of the enslaved who built Old Queens and how much their masters were paid. There are a number of other details, but the bottom line is that by the summer of 2016, we had enough to write a book of essays about the slave ownership of Rutgers' founding fathers. Now, lastly, I will end with this point. The Committee on the Disenfranchised and Enslaved Populations in Rutgers History included a list of recommendations at the end of our first volume of Scarlet and Black. Many of the recommendations have been implemented or are in the process of being implemented, including the publication of a more complete history of African Americans at Rutgers. We really thought it was important. even though this was not part of the first mandate, that we talk about not just what happens with slavery, but the legacy that lives on and the result of those policies that were implemented and during the time that Rutgers was being built. We did say that we wanted the physical and the virtual tours of Rutgers to be changed, and that has happened. We have created a digital tour, the establishment of retention scholarships, the appointment of a postdoctoral fellow to help with the administration of the project, the allocation of funds to help promote the annual New Jersey Native American Folk Festival, the naming of new buildings. A lot of this has come to pass. One of the most important recommendations that has not been implemented is the creation of a diversity course requirement. In this regard, it's important to note that when Rutgers created the Committee on the Disenfranchised and Enslaved Populations in Rutgers History, it also created another committee on diversity and inclusion. That committee issued a different report with some of the same recommendations, but its report was much more comprehensive and extensive regarding the steps Rutgers needed to take to make Rutgers more inclusive. And I will say that I welcome the division of labor, but I must also note that as of this date, the Scarlet and Black Project has received a lot more press, and more of its recommendations have been acted on than the Committee on Diversity and Inclusion. Now, I mentioned this division of labor because I believe it was strategic and important. Perhaps they did it on purpose, the university, but I certainly appreciated it because I undertook the research task because it was something I knew I could do if given the support. And I emphasize that because, you know, I can't diversify the faculty, I can't institute a diversity requirement. I and the committee that I worked with can't create a Center for African American Studies or give scholarships, etc. Overall, I'm pleased with the project and how it has progressed. We accomplished our aims because our administration was willing to provide all the support needed to complete this project. My department and colleagues were equally supportive and encouraging. I encountered no opposition. If anything, I was the one who initially had some doubts. The university was and is committed to the project. That has been the key to its success. Leadership comes from the top, and we have had the support of everyone in the leadership of Rutgers, including the Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion, the new Chancellor, and also now including our new President, Dr. Jonathan Holloway, who, by the way, is from your area, or we managed to get him from Chicago, from Northwestern. And I'll end there.
And I think this means it's my turn. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I think you'll hear some really similar themes in my talk about what's happened at the University of Virginia. So my work here at UVA regarding truth-telling as part of a university project coming to terms with slavery and racism in the school's past began in 2013. But the foundations for that work began several years earlier, in 2007. This is when the state of Virginia was preparing to celebrate its 400-year anniversary, and the General Assembly decided that they needed to issue a statement of profound regret for slavery before they could begin the work of celebrating Virginia. They did so. Our Board of Visitors followed suit a couple weeks later, also issued a statement of profound regret for slavery, and so we were at the first awkward moment of acknowledgement for a past that many would rather have not talked about. But we did it, and that's important, and so you'll hear me discuss how we responded in 2007, and it was awkward. they decided to install a plaque at UVA, the first marker of any kind at UVA acknowledging the reality of slavery at the school. It was a 1x4, so about 1 foot wide, 4 foot wide, 4 foot long slate plaque embedded in the ground as the threshold to an archway in an underground passageway at the Rotunda. This is the center of the academical village at UVA. It's a half-scale copy of the Roman Pantheon that was designed to be the university's temple of knowledge and a library. And it has an underground passageway. And that's where they put the plaque. So this is a plaque that, right, speaks volumes about where the university was in 2007 in acknowledging that history. That they were hoping no one would notice and that this would go away quietly and they could no longer talk about difficult things. They further inscribed it with language that acknowledged the several hundred free and enslaved workers who helped build the university from 1817 to 1826, thus realizing Thomas Jefferson's vision for the university. So as a memorial plaque, right, it is problematic in so many ways. It's buried in the ground. It's further buried in the ground in a walkway that's already underground. It commingles enslaved and free workers at UVA. It only acknowledges enslaved people as at the school during the decade of construction, and then ultimately puts the plaque, their lives, and their labor in service of Thomas Jefferson's vision, which is a problem unique to the University of Virginia. The good news is because this plaque was so awkward and did such a terrible job of appropriate acknowledgement, students walked over it and immediately objected. So in 2007, our faculty and student body, I would say not deeply activist at the time, still found the plaque wholly inadequate for all the reasons I've just mentioned. So a handful of dedicated students formed their own independent student group, Memorial for Enslaved Laborers. And they began an awareness-raising campaign. This was about, let's do things that make everybody at the university aware that this plaque exists and that it's, right, not even honest about the history, and we could do so much more. Their work culminated in a memorial design competition in 2011 that wasn't about building an actual memorial. It was about using the creative project of thinking about how we should appropriately acknowledge the enslaved at UVA as a way to raise awareness. It's a great project. It had a community engagement aspect to it. And this sort of started to kick off a whole lot of other activity at the university. Other student groups began rethinking the stories they were telling about UVA and how they presented the 21st century university. An alumni group formed that was committed to funding diversity, equity, access, and inclusion projects at the university. And those two groups ultimately convinced the chief officer of diversity and equity to go to the president and say, we really need to form a commission, fully examine this history, and think about what we can do in the 21st century. So President Marisa Sullivan responded in 2013, founded what's known as the President's Commission on Slavery in the University. I was asked to be the lead scholar. I co-chaired that commission with our then Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Marcus Martin, who is an emergency medicine expert, but had served on the president's cabinet. So I think this speaks to, as Professor White just mentioned, right, the way that it's really important to have presidential leadership and people on the president's cabinet supporting your work. We had that. We were charged, though, with researching the history of slavery at the university, educating the university about our findings, and then making recommendations for the future while also considering appropriate memorialization. So this was a recipe for several commission meetings with lunch, right? A lovely time, printing up a report with recommendations, patting ourselves on the back, and then waiting for our work to be replicated by another commission in a decade. The commission was large. It's a service commission. There were 27 people on the commission. We were committed to doing much more. We even debated starting with tackling the living wage. We made a decision that no, we had to sort of connect the dots, fully understand the era of slavery at the university, and then insistently talk about the legacies and keep drawing the line to the 21st century. So, only focused on slavery, we started with a bit of a tailwind, right? Students were eager to have us do much more. And at every point over our run over the past 8 years, students would say, that's great, but what about all these other things you should be doing? We also had some alumni eager to see where the truth-telling would lead and hopeful that our work could create meaningful change at UVA. We started by focusing on research. I'm a scholar of the 18th and 19th century South. So I was excited to dive into the archives and go through the material. What we learned should not be surprising, right? University of Virginia is the flagship state university of the largest and most powerful slaveholding state in the United States, right? There are more enslaved people in Virginia right up until 1865 than there are in any other state in the 19th century US. The university is situated in a part of the state that's a center of concentrated enslavement. So over half the adult white male property owning population of the county the university was situated in owned at least one human being. So this is a site of concentrated enslavement. The university itself, when it opens, it's a college. It's an urban settlement. It's in fact, basically the day it opens, it's the largest urban settlement within probably 50 miles of the university, and it's a plantation where 4,000 or more enslaved people over a 50-year period lived and labored here. This was between 100 and 200 enslaved people living at UVA in any given year. Although a public school, it was very expensive to attend UVA. This was a state that had no commitment to public education beyond this university. And it catered to the wealthy white sons of the slaveholding class, largely from other southern states. Jefferson himself, by 1821, was seeing it as a university that could create and engage citizen leaders that would protect the interests of the South. And by the 1830s, it's actually an incubator of pro-slavery and white supremacist thought. So it's creating engaged citizen leaders who are going to leave Charlottesville and become leaders across the slave states and the Confederacy. And just to give you one number, 7 of 16 Confederate cabinet members were UVA alums, and we were represented in nearly every Confederate state house during those 4 years. So it became the very thing that was starting to emerge in 1830, this incubator for that thought. With that knowledge in hand, we pushed beyond our charge and started a sustained community engagement process. We are embedded in a community, Charlottesville and Albemarle County, and really a surrounding series of counties beyond that we've been embedded in for 200 years, and we have a difficult relationship with that community. So, and we knew that in that community, the descendants of people enslaved at the university still lived, and some of them worked at the university. So we decided we had to work directly with the community with humility, listen to them, and shape how we were responding to what we were hearing. So some of our work was truth-telling in the community. They already kind of knew the broad outlines of this history, but we had to tell it to them over and over and over again to build trust and create space for that meaningful conversation. We also sought to tell the truth and better educate current and future students about our findings. And we did a lot of alumni engagement to help our alumni base come to terms with the school's history that was likely far different than what they remembered from their student days. And finally, as I said earlier, we wanted to connect this to more recent and contemporary issues. It wasn't a story that was going to be contained by the 1865 end date. And finally, we knew we had to make changes to the built landscape here, that UVA is part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site that includes Monticello. It's very committed to preserving Thomas Jefferson's architectural vision, and the history of slavery is hidden in plain sight everywhere in this landscape. But there have been significant changes, right? The gardens that are behind all the pavilions on the lawn are now beautiful ornamental gardens. They were redone in the 50s and 60s that are not based in the historical reality. Those were work yards and living spaces where the enslaved did much of the support of faculty and students at the university. So we knew we had to make changes to this landscape so that even the casual visitor would be less likely to come here and leave and only think about this as a place where, right, Thomas Jefferson and other people thought great thoughts while sitting in a garden. So we thought that was really important. We couldn't end without having made those changes. Our goals changed as the conversation with the community grew. We learned early on that a memorial was really important. The very first person who stood up and spoke at our very first community engagement meeting in 2014 told us, you better darn well build a memorial. It better be big, it better be visible, and we better be able to get to it. And don't build it on the lawn. We aren't welcome there. We heard that very clearly. So we knew that all of our work would have to happen with continued significant community input. So again, started with a strong tailwind of student and alumni interest in our work. We faced that reality that most people at UVA did not know the history, and simply issuing a report at the end of our work would not ensure that they would know that history now or in the future. We committed to adding interpretive exhibits across our campus, to naming new buildings, and making the details of this history visible in as many ways as possible. So we created tours, we created walking tour maps that you could self-guide. We built an app so that people could do the tour from their phone. We created museum exhibits, again, interpretive panels in buildings, social media programs, a curriculum of classes at UVA teaching this history, a book, 2 websites, summer camps for high school students so that we could start teaching this history and getting to think about it before they came to UVA, and then working with K-12 teachers locally so that this history also at least started to reshape how students are being taught at the local level. The work has definitely had an impact here. There's much more widespread knowledge about the realities of slavery and white supremacy in the university's history, much more interest in broadly continuing to rethink how we tell our own history and in making this a more inclusive place. We issued our report in 2018. Our book, Educated in Tyranny, came out in 2019. And we now have a second presidential commission on the university in the age of segregation. I did not name this, so if you want to quibble with what the age of segregation looks like, you'd be correct. But it's at least saying we're going to now go on and look at the next 100 years. I'm also co-leading that with a member of the community. So that commission started in 2018. We continued the work. We were continuing the community engagement until the pandemic. And we have completed and will dedicate next week a substantial and beautiful memorial to the enslaved here. Yep, it's a symbol, but it was one the community said was really important. And I love it that it lives on as something that's really not the university's anymore. We're gonna dedicate it next week. We've launched a descendant project that's been going on for almost 2 years now. We've identified over 100 families who are descended from those who were enslaved at the university, and are working on programming and support for descendants here. So I think some of this promises to actually mean our recommendations from our report in 2018. Some of them might actually end up coming into place. With an eye to the world beyond UVA, we also made a decision in 2015 that if our work was to matter, and if we were to make sure that academia was more widely committed to following Ruth Simmons's visionary and courageous work at Brown, which is now almost 20 years ago, we would have to encourage other schools to do the work. So I'll end with, we founded a consortium called Universities Studying Slavery that now includes over 80 schools in 5 countries. That was originally, let's just make it easier for a school to step in and do this. Right, when the first question we got asked at every meeting was, what are other schools doing? We now have this really large group to point to. So I think it's really exciting to see that work spread to so many other schools and to share our knowledge, our best practices from the schools that are much farther along with the schools entering this work. In many ways, right, almost 9 years into this work at UVA, we have accomplished a lot, but we still have a lot more work to do. So in 2014, our motto was, it is still just the beginning. It's 2021. I think it is still just the beginning of this work. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kirt, and also to Marisa and Deborah for those wonderful presentations and really rich overviews of the work that you've done with these processes. What I'm going to do is just put a few questions out, and then I'm hoping as we begin the discussion, questions will come in from colleagues and others attending on the webinar, and we can begin to bring those in and have a conversation that will go on until 5:30 when we have to close. I think what I want to do to start is to pick up, Kirt, on something you brought up, which is that in a sense, life on your campus changed at least in two ways. One was that the built environment, the ways in which the history of the institution's formation, who it was that was recognized as constitutive of tradition and the kind of sense of exemplifying the university community, all of that was intervened upon and to some degree altered. So interpretation, memorialization, the building of structures. Deborah and Marisa, you also spoke to this at Rutgers. That's one way in which life on campus seems to change when people engage in these inquiry processes. And I'd just ask you to reflect on that and say more about what's accomplished and what you feel still needs to be done. But the second part of it perhaps goes back to your point about the officers of the Confederacy coming out of UVA and being alumni, that in a sense, the thought that is on the campus, what people understand to personify one's institution or one's community intellectually, I suppose, or in terms of reflections on society, potentially that begins to change as well. And people begin to think about what kinds of ideas are produced at universities that actually contribute to these structures of inequality and these structures of marginalization. They begin to think differently about how the producing of knowledge is actually foundational to creating social separations and social inequities. And I'm wondering, I guess, how you felt like the work within these processes suggested ways of being thought leaders at the campus that not only had impact on how people felt like they belonged at the campus, but what it is that the campuses were actually supposed to do. Clearly here, I think publishing the volumes of scholarship, The Scarlet and Black, is a really good way of thinking about intervening on how people think about the very identity of a university by producing scholarship. But I think those two levels, changing the environment and changing how people imagine the thought that really exemplifies and sort of symbolizes that university community. If you could speak about the processes and the ways in which it allowed you to intervene on that, and what more work you feel like needs to be done in both of those areas.
Did you want me to start?
Sure. Any of you could.
Well, I'm struck by that until 2020, we had a sign on a garden wall that had been there since 1952 that said Thomas Jefferson built the walls. Not only designed them, built them. So we had a real mountain to climb to unpack, right, the cult of Jefferson here. And move away from only acknowledging or almost exclusively acknowledging a white male faculty and founders from the early 19th century. As I'd said, we had students and community members who had been pushing for individual moments of change here. That sign has finally been changed. It's finally gone. So I'm really glad. And I think that for us, the only way to tackle that myth is initially through the actual built landscape. So, right, we renovated 2 different enslaved cemeteries, did interpretation of both of them. One of them wasn't even discovered until 2012, right? People were tailgating on it until 2012. So we really worked to make that super visible. So even a first-year student, right, walking from the dorm to class was going to run into some of this material. And we knew that this worked. When we did the cemetery, we've done 2 memorial services there that were candlelight vigils with a libation service. This is right adjacent to some of our dormitories. And students came out and joined it, right? So sometimes just connecting with people in those ways is really important. We redesigned the visitor center at the Rotunda. So now Slavery is woven into that story. There are artifacts. There's a chemical hearth that an enslaved man ran for decades that's visible, and this gets talked about in the interpretive panels. The dormitories have large exhibits. We have one dormitory named after an enslaved couple. It's directly across the street from the largest gym and the stadium. So I think that work is, for us, has been really, really important, that we had to do that here. And then the second part of your question, can you repeat it, Adam?
I think just how the ways in which colleagues, others at the university, think about thought and knowledge and producing knowledge at the university as a result of reckoning with these projects.
We also benefited from there, and I'll be brief so Deborah and Marisa can chime in here. We benefited from other faculty at the university from before my time here had students doing projects on this. So Gregory Dorr published a book in 2012 on eugenics that's really looking at knowledge production around eugenics at UVA in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So we knew pieces of the puzzle from scholarship that had already gone on here. And that encouraged us, even in the slavery area, we knew we had to look carefully, even though the first goal was on really kind of trying to capture the lives and humanity of the enslaved from records that were likely to not yield a lot of those stories. But that we also had to look at the knowledge production piece. And it took us all of about 5 minutes. I think one of the first letters we ran into was an alum and his brother who were Unionists from Kentucky. And the brother was here in the 1850s. And in the letter, they were complaining about how crazy the university was, that every class, no matter what the topic was, spent a lot of the time in the classroom in the 1850s talking about pro-slavery ideology. And so we knew that, even in the 19th century university, which was not the modern university, it wasn't committed to knowledge production the way the modern university is, that it was already that kind of producer of a certain kind of knowledge that left the university. So we were careful when we looked at the next 100 years to immediately begin examining, what was being taught in the classroom? What do the lecture notes look like? What were the works professors were publishing? Why were they founding the departments they were founding? For us at UVA, we didn't have a university president until 1904. And it was at that moment that the modern professional research university began to emerge here. And so we knew in that second phase, we had to look really closely at that work. And again, it's that we benefited from scholarship that predated both commissions.
Thank you.
I wanted to add that, or start from a place of just marking the differences between Rutgers and UVA in a profound way, in that there was less of there was a need to educate, but less of a need to re-educate in a way, because of the population of our campus that has always been not always, has recently been very diverse, right? Urban campuses. That in a way, I'm listening to the work Kirt is doing, and I'm thinking, well, there was so much student activism by Black and Brown students that I wonder why they didn't sort of press more into this early history. And I thought, oh, well, actually, because they had other pressing things at hand, right? And in particularly, this is obvious in the 20th century, because they were involved in civil rights, involved in Black power. So in terms of changing the thought at the university, they fought directly to that, right? The administration, they fought back against faculty, many of whom were against some of the Black student movement, so that there has really always been a real active student population that has directed the thought and protested the thought, from university presidents saying things that resemble eugenics in the 1990s, to disc jockeys calling our basketball team racial slurs. Students protested. So there's less of that work that we've had to do to kind of push people to think. but rather, some of the visible things on campus. I think one is that the pandemic has caused, the student population to not be on campus. So they haven't seen the recent efforts that we're making to do these historical markers. So they haven't been in the dorm to like reflect on that. But I would say too that the research, the volume 2 came out in March of this year. Was
Last year.
Last
Volume 2 came out in last year.
I don't know what year it is, but okay. So, and then volume 3 is coming. It takes a while for those texts to circulate. And so I'm very excited about the response from the students. And I will just say too, that I've had recently several conversations with the Rutgers Undergraduate Student Association, both the body and the president, who has come to me to ask what they can do around issues of reparations. And while I said, you're here for such a short amount of time, these are students that have been affected by last summer and the visibility of Black Lives Matter protests nationally and internationally. So they're thinking about the present, and they're thinking about what we can do to kind of to give back or to change things on campus. And I told them, actually, the demands have to come from you, and you have to actually tell us what is most pressing, right? Because we have been knee deep in this research and laser focused on getting these books out, but we haven't largely had a forum with undergrads since 2016. So I think that's all to come. But I do think that the situation, just by virtue of the population and by virtue of the activism of the students historically at Rutgers, is different.
And what I'd like to add to that is that it being a Northern school, one of the things that this history has done is force people to reconsider what Northern slavery was like. I mean, basically, New Jersey had people who were still enslaved at the beginning of the Civil War, and people who were actually freed with the 13th Amendment. And a lot of that had to do with the way that the quote unquote gradual emancipation acts, the way that they function. So for a lot of folks, it was like, well, we don't, New Jersey was in the North. And so we don't really have any, we don't really have a history of slavery. And yet New Jersey is settled, particularly in the middle counties of Jersey, with those that were very close to New York. New Jersey is settled by the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company was one of the largest, the most profitable slave, not just slave holding, but slave trafficking companies in the Black Atlantic during the 16th and 17th century. So understanding, I'm in a building, for example, I'm in Van Dyke Hall, and quite frankly, until I started this project, I really didn't think about who these buildings were really named at. I really didn't pay too much attention to the statues on campus. But afterwards, I started to think about this. And then even the fact that Henry Rutgers, UVA, it's University of Virginia, it's on Jefferson's plantation, but at the same time, Rutgers is named after a prominent slaveholder in New Jersey. And this is forcing people to, for those people who think, well, we really didn't have slavery in New Jersey, it really wasn't big here, it ended very soon, to understand the part that New Jersey had in perpetuating the institution. We have members who were leaders in the American Colonization Society. And that kind of history, it tells a story of how national slavery was, not that it was just a Southern institution. And we are able, through this history, to make sure that people really understand that. And that is important. And also to make some changes with the Sojourner Truth apartments, which is a new dormitory on campus. We're able to, people are like, well, she was a famous feminist. Yeah, well, that you can get on the internet. But the fact that she was owned by one of the founding fathers of Rutgers, and if you walk a couple of 100 yards, you can find a building that's named after Hardenberg. It's Hardenberg Hall. So I think that Marisa makes a very good point in understanding and telling us that in terms of the student reaction, it's really hard for us to tell you what it is or will be, because the pandemic sort of just bingo put a stop to all of that. But I do think it's important to note that even though Rutgers is a northern institution and urban institutions, its ties to slavery are deep, very deep.
So there are two questions that have come in, and I think I want to introduce them and just give the choice to both of you, or all of you, how to answer them. One is a general question about expanding a bit more on how communities surrounding your institutions, your universities, New Brunswick, but also for that matter, Newark and Camden, in terms of thinking about the Rutgers system, were included and engaged in the planning and execution of these projects. Of course, Charlottesville, which has a particular kind of inflection of this after 2017. And if I could put a bit of a gloss on that, just drawing on the conversations that we had preliminary to this panel, thinking about the choices that were made to bring this history from the initial concentration on slavery to more contemporary issues. So how to think about the kinds of concerns about community well-being, for instance, that student activists were engaged in the 1960s and afterwards, or thinking about, in the case of Charlottesville and perhaps communities in New Jersey as well, instruments or mechanisms of enforcing segregation like restrictive covenants or other forms that it sounds like were particularly of concern in terms of the Charlottesville Community Board. So just that question of engaging community and how that's impacted your work with these panels. Maybe we'll start with that, and then I'll bring the second question in after you've had a chance to address that.
Thank you for those questions. I will say that community involvement in the research projects has been tangible in some ways in the first volume, but perhaps more in the second and third, in the sense that we started this project as internal to Rutgers to do this research and to write these books. And with the release of them have garnered community attention. And one of the biggest projects that we've been involved in is really a reciprocal relationship with one of the oldest Black church in New Brunswick, the AME Church, that was part of this very early history of, community building in the free and enslaved African-American community during the time of the first volume. So students from this project have then worked with the AME Church to digitize their archives. And with the resources that we have been able to get to them to then preserve their own history for the future, for their future. And I want to say that, I know that we have a limited amount of time, but our public historian, Kristen O'Brazel Kaufman, she has been actually engaged with public history and more outreach to the community, which has included curriculum development for schools, and has really been plugged into the New Brunswick community in specifically, on how we can have some of this material be in the schools and have community involvement back at Rutgers. I mean, this goes and fans out into scholarship programs and outreach programs for students in New Brunswick and reaching out. These programs have been in existence actually since before the publications, but reinvested by President Holloway to really focus on making sure people from the community actually are coming to Rutgers. And this is New Brunswick. Newark and Camden have their own, it's a kind of unwieldy institution, but they have their own investment in making sure, Newark in particular, that the community is always engaged with the development. And Rutgers and Camden are actually where the diversity is most prevalent. When I say that the campuses are diverse, that Camden has focused their efforts on making sure that students from the community get into Camden, but also that their tuition is covered. And they've made some financial decisions around that have been, they have to kind of contend with the broader administration about what that looks like in terms of debt and restructuring and all of that. So each campus has its unique surrounding community. Certainly Camden is a site where there was a lot of activism between and together with community and students during the 60s when there was urban uprising. So there's been community reciprocity historically, and I think once these volumes come out, we get a lot of response from the community, both with people that are interested in genealogy and doing research at Rutgers in our archives, but also demands that there be a more accountability to communities. And we have, again, activist history at Rutgers where student faculty members have been really fighting against public school closure in the New Brunswick community that primarily serve African-American and Latinx populations. And so, we're in conversation about that as well.
I'll just chime in and say, all right, for us, our community engagement, I think that we're a small city. So the context is right where it's really intimate, that the center of the university where the Rotunda and the Academical Village are is about 2 miles from the center of downtown Charlottesville. So it's really close by. Students live, over half of our students don't live in university housing, so they live in these communities. So I think it's been easy for us that we're not really looking at multiple campuses. It's really geographically confined, and you can't really draw a line between the university and the community when you do this work. That in terms of staff and faculty are often part of this story, as well as the local community. So we've worked insistently to go into the community, not so much to help them research, but to ask them to tell us what we wanted to do to build that relationship, and actually often learn from them. We have a really active, my current co-chair with the new commission runs the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. It's a community center that's really charged with preserving the history of Black Charlottesville. And so with that piece, we work to support programming there in the community and connect to very active genealogy groups and local history groups that often when we started knew more of the history than we did. So we've looked at how can we share with them the material we're scanning, but then also learn from them about the details, about the kind of mapping this history onto the local area. So I think the project's a little different there, but we found it really, really important to start to mend that relationship. And Adam, you had referenced restrictive covenants, right? That's part of our story in the early 20th century here, that the university is intimately involved in not only rezoning and using restrictive covenants to reshape Charlottesville, it's actively involved in destroying Black communities. The most prominent one is known as Vinegar Hill. It is bulldozed in the 1964 and 1965 as ostensibly an urban renewal project, but it's actually a response to civil rights activism in the local community, right? It's a message to the community. And the university is even involved. Our current new hospital complex is built in a neighborhood called Gospel Hill. The last residents were evicted in 1984. And so that may not have been an explicitly racist program, right? This may have been the university simply buying up rental properties in a plan to take over the neighborhood to build a hospital. But I think it speaks to this very long history of, one, the university and local community leaders for a century and a half being committed to limiting or destroying Black economic and political success wherever it appeared in the community, and then using those zoning policies to benefit the university after the fact. So we're still wrestling with telling that story as a way to again mend fences with the community. Again, we've had some success, right? It's fragile. You don't undo 200 years of history in 5 years of coffees and community engagement events.
I would just add that I think the beauty of doing the 3 volumes, I said that it was actually when I was asked to do this, I only initially signed on to just do a 1 volume, and that was the slavery volume. But the beauty of doing 3 is to be able to see the legacy of slavery. So when people talk, and particularly lay folk, when they say, well, get over it, it was slavery, it was a long time ago. One of the things that you can do by looking at the first volume of our work goes to the Civil War and looks at Rutgers' transformation into a land grant institution. And then the second volume goes to 1945 to through World War II. And then the third volume takes us from 1945 to the present, or to the 21st century. And actually you can see what the legacy of slavery, what the result of all of that discrimination, of what did slavery, what it wrought, and how ideas of thought, because we're also talking about how Rutgers perpetuated the ideology of Black inferiority. And we're dealing with, how this gets dealt with in the classroom. We look at curriculums, we look at essay contests. And so, when you're looking and you see in the 1890s and in 1910, you still have the notion that, Blacks and whites will never get along, maybe Blacks ought to go back to Africa. You see the ideology of the American Colonization Society perpetuated, and all the way into the 20th century. And that, I think, is, we also look at Rutgers missionary missions, but their missions overseas, and exactly how these ideas about inferior peoples, quote unquote, gets worked out in the classroom, again, in essay contests, gets worked out in the way that they divvy up dormitories and whether or not Black people can stay on campus, and the problem, quote unquote, of having Blacks and whites live together. So, some of the material that we're dealing with, it doesn't ostensibly right up front look as if it's racist. A lot of it is manifest destiny, but at the same time, we see how slavery lived on. And I see that there's someone who is asked a question about the Chicago School of Thought and how it contributes to enslavement systems. When you start with Black people are inferior and you bring it up through the 20th century, in tracing that history from Chicago, you can actually see, you will be able to see exactly, be able to answer that question, how has the Chicago School of Thought contributed to Black enslavement systems. But without, that long train of history, you might not be able to see it.
I also wanted to thank you. I wanted to bring attention to that question, which was posted via Facebook by Prince Mallory about the Chicago School of Thought and its particular relationship to thinking about criminal justice and race. And maybe a gloss as well on that question. All of these inquiry processes were taking place starting in 2013, 2015. They were very much within the shadow of the ways in which Black Lives Matters, activism in relation to racialized violence, state violence against Black people, anti-Blackness, as people understood it, in relation to practices around law and law enforcement, really needed to be thought about at the center of the story of structural racism. And I guess I'm wondering, thinking about your process over these years, how did those sorts of questions filter in from time to time? What were the ways in which perhaps either members of commissions or student activists or community members, in a sense, kind of encouraged you to expand your brief, to think about these manifestations as they were emerging? Deborah, your point about the continuities of this, of course, is very much at the center of it. But I'm just wondering whether there was also some intensity in terms of living through the history of the last 5 or 6 years while doing work on these inquiry processes.
I mean, for me, that's a difficult question to answer because I think that we are all always affected. I mean, we like to think that history is, this study of objectivity, and we don't bring who we are, and we don't bring what has happened to us or current events into our study. But I think we do. I think that one of the most important things that has influenced our study has been the rise of interdisciplinary history and intersectionality. I think that when you even open our very first volume, you see the influence of Dr. Fuentes' work. I mean, how did we go about getting some of this history, for example, of New Brunswick, without really having all of the documents that we needed? Well, what happened, for those of you who don't know, and I'll just do very briefly, Marisa's book starts with a runaway slave, and because she only has this one little document from a runaway slave, but what does she do? She goes and she finds some of the maps. And so she finds the maps and says, okay, of early Barbados, what would this enslaved woman who's running away, what would she have encountered? And we used some of those same techniques, or many of our students did. So they found early maps of New Brunswick. And what do you want to know was one of the most prominent structures in New Brunswick? The jail. Okay, and that you could find being that's the most prominent structure in most enslaved societies, because that's where they kept slave people. All right, so when you think about the most important structures, when you think about the most important institutions, and then you continue on that that line of thought and line of inquiry, yeah, you can see how criminal justice and how control of Black bodies is centered in early America. And then if you keep looking at that, you can bring it right up to the present. So I do think that the new interdisciplinary history, looking and bringing geography and bringing feminist thought into our modes of inquiry, that has really contributed to being able to interpret these scraps that we have from this period. And of course, interdisciplinary history has come as a result of our need to know more about unrepresented people. So in that way, I think clearly the present has informed the past and also informed the way we even do history.
I'll just add briefly that, again, I really think when we're able to present this work to the larger community, there's been a gap. And the first volume came out in 2016. We were not on campus for the second volume's publication, and the third will be out in a month. I think that given the experience of students in the pandemic, and I'm teaching right now, so I can really kind of see how hard it's been for them to be home, but also with last summer's movements, that there's sort of a momentum that I think will come out when we have this conversation and when we are able to present it publicly. And I think even just from the conversations I've had with the Rutgers, undergrad president, that they're already thinking about this present context and what they can do with this work. So I'm hoping that, I think we're hoping that the conversation to a broader community, including the wider community that Rutgers is situated in, will help to generate more community involvement and more community input and stakeholding that can be generated from a sort of insular research that we've been doing, but now will be public.
We've got about 15 minutes left, so I do want to invite those that are on the call and have questions or comments to please bring them in so that we can put them in the queue and our panelists can respond to them. Let me pick up on one of the last points in Kirt's presentation, which was to talk about the University Studying Slavery Consortium. And, what in essence are the ways in which institutions not only dig down and learn about themselves, but can consult and I suppose support one another in terms of trading best practices about how to do this kind of work. And I just might ask, maybe Kirt would take the lead on this, perhaps. I'm sure he's the most familiar with it. But Marisa and Deborah, also, if you think about this in relation to consulting efforts at other schools, what's important about schools looking around and campus communities looking around and seeing what different institutions are doing? What are some best practices that happen at other institutions that might be referred to by people concerned with launching these processes, but also those that are leading campuses thinking about the value of having these processes take place within them? What are some ways of thinking about that collaborative conversation that's happening in terms of these inquiry processes across many universities, as you said, Kirt, now across many countries as well?
So just briefly, I'm just sort of struck by when we started our work, we reached out to Brown University, Emory, right? Alabama had an apology for slavery in 2004. It didn't really go anywhere, but it was driven by a couple faculty. We basically brought them in as consultants in 2013 on a national advisory board and realized that it was a really good idea that right when we started, we had this kind of vaporous charge. We knew how to do the research, but we wanted to do a lot more, and we had no idea what was going to work. And those conversations were really rich. And so we thought, let's do this as a way to make it easier. So I say it as a joke, but it started as, let's make a little school of fish that makes it safe for schools to go, we're going to do this, right? In 2013, there weren't many schools doing this. And there was a lot of fear about doing it. And it speaks to your earlier question about what was the moment. I know the question we were asked repeatedly in kind of quiet conversation was, if we talk about this, is this work going to bring protests? So it was on everyone's mind. And I still chuckle about that, because I would roll my eyes and go, are you kidding? If you just sit back and keep doing what you've been doing, you're going to have protests, and I'm going to go join them, because it's silly that we are not doing what a university should be doing, right? Which is being unafraid to turn the microscope on ourselves. So we created the School of Fish as a way to answer the question we were getting, but also encourage other schools to get it. And as soon as we did it, we realized this is really important, that this conversation a couple times a year where people from schools get together, every school's context and story and history is different, but we learn from each other. I am stunned to go to, the last time we had an in-person conference was fall 2019, and it was University of Cincinnati and Xavier. 600 people in attendance. It was this huge event. And I ended up sitting in the hallway talking to someone from a tiny liberal arts college who just started their project, and I came home with an answer to what I thought was an unsolvable problem here at my home campus. And I think you can hear from our comments today, as you do this work, it's easy for your field of vision to narrow every day, right? You run into the realities of being at a university. There are budgetary issues. There are structural issues, right? There are political issues. And so every day you get up and you go, well, I can only do it just narrows and narrows. I can only do this much. And you start to only see the roadblocks. And those conversations give you ways to creatively solve the problem you were solving. So I think that's really spoken to it. And it started in 2015 as an informal gathering of Virginia schools. So it was just sort of an idea. We called a few schools, brought them together. Again, we had sandwiches, we had workshops. And then protests erupted at Georgetown University in fall 2015. And that's what changed the conversation, that they reached out to us. We had a conversation. I came up and we did a teach-in. And I spent the whole day there. And when I left, I went, well, this is silly. It shouldn't be Virginia schools, right? Everybody should be doing this. And so we renamed it, shortened the name to University Studying Slavery. Georgetown joined. And I think since then, so at 5 years, it's been a school a month joining since early 2016, that it really has a head of steam going. And it's sustained until the pandemic, 2 conferences a year, which is sort of, I think, unheard of, right, in disciplinary conferences, right? We have multiple different conferences a year, but the same organization doesn't hold one each year. And it speaks to what Deborah was talking about, right? They're deeply interdisciplinary. And since 2017, there's been a push to go, right? It needs to be descendants. It needs to be genealogists. It needs to be historic sites. It needs to be museums, and even community and activist groups. So, right, the groups committed to reparations show up because it's always a point of conversation at every university about the acknowledgement and the atonement and the education and the research are great, but when are you going to address the lasting legacies in the here and now? So I think it's beyond best practices that comes out of it. It's connecting to different, museums and historic sites have often been doing this work a lot longer than universities. Again, imperfectly in the same way that universities have, but we found it really, really instructive to do that. And we now, right, there are a number of HBCUs that are involved, which also give us critical perspective on what are the ways universities can rethink what it means to repair. Like, I am just struck by how as soon as we say repair, we immediately get hung up on what's now a 30-year-old canard that, right, reparations is writing checks to everyone. And maybe it should be. I'm not debating that, but that sort of always stops the conversation. I'm remembering in 2015 when Harvard had its conference, and Ta-Nehisi Coates turned to the audience and said, "Reparations, say it with me," and everyone kind of smiled and chuckled. And here we are 6 years later, right? We've really not engaged in it, right? A few schools have attempted to dip into this, but maybe one of the best practices we can get out of this is to creatively think how together schools can engage in it and create processes that are committing university resources, right, to addressing equity in the here and now. So anyway, I could go on
I
all
wanted
day.
to
So
add and address, thank you for that, Kirt. I want to add and address the question that is directed to Kirt in the chat, to just say a couple of things, starting with the Harvard conference that we were a part of. What is this role in upper level administrators in this process of redress, right? Let's think about the word redress adjacent to reparations, because I think redress does much more work. And in our experience, I would say, yes, administrators took credit and sort of cultural capital from the work that we've done, right? And said, look, Rutgers got ahead of this in a lot of ways. And we acknowledge that, right? As they gave us the resources to do what we needed to do. And I think that the role of these administrators really is to really have a reflective moment about their ethics, and decide what they think is important in terms of redress. And in doing so, know that then they need to provide the resources so the folks can do the work, and then step back. So we've had Rutgers administrators involved in the project the whole time, but all we're doing with them is saying, here's what we've done. We need more funding and give it to us, because if you do, when we do this, then you can send out a media report that shows you're doing this, but step back and let us do the work, and also let us have ownership of it. So when you have someone who's fiddling about with, well, I'm not sure how this makes my family look, at the end of the day, it's about the work we did. And we have the authority to say, well, this is the research and this is the history. So this is what it should say. So I really do think it's up to and I remember the Harvard thing in particular, because there's a way in which a university, I was gonna say a random Ivy League, I wasn't gonna call out, but let me just say that moment was a moment of a self-congratulation for being part of this process, but that they're still far behind, bless their heart, in actually producing the work that has been done at UVA, for example. Like, they have now revamped their project on Harvard and slavery, and they're taking our postdoc from us to lead that project, right? So that's a big gap in years in terms of getting momentum. So there's one thing about having, other universities come together and talk about best practices, but the work needs to be done, and it can't be just about self-congratulation. And the ethics here is that the university has to acknowledge their responsibility in creating inequity and disempowerment, providing resources to redress it, and then letting folks do the work.
And I would just add to that part of the ethics is really not to overburden assistant professors, people who don't have tenure. Part of the ethics is really to fund the work that you want done. And just too frequently, we know that lots of times you get people who really need to focus on their own work, and it's unfortunate. I mean, this is the kind of thing that they're interested in, but quite frankly, lots of times universities, in terms of their ethics, they take advantage of scholars who, and particularly scholars of color, who want to do this work for all kinds of reasons, but to get it done, but also they take advantage of them. So it's really important that people undertake this work, people who have tenure, and that's what I would say. I would just say that this is something you do after tenure.
One more thing I would just add. Yes, even though I did it prior to having tenure, but I will say.
Yeah, but your book was already was out there.
It was?
Yes.
Okay. So I would say that that again, I think Deborah mentioned this at the beginning, that the folks that are doing the actual work oftentimes are the most overburdened already. So having compensation in some way, and I'll tell you the ways that I've been compensated. I've been given time back because the work has been spent on this and I really want to get to my second book. I've been given time off that I gave to the project. I have an endowed chair that recognizes both the work that we've done, but also the commitment to do the second and third volume. So giving the resources to the people doing the work makes the work possible. Without it, it is impossible. And I want to make sure that that is said.
So we thank you. We only have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left, and perhaps I'll ask as a closeout question. As you know, we're in the process of trying to launch a kind of similar process here in discussion with senior university leaders in terms of thinking about a truth commission that would address the university's relationship to community over history, various communities adjacent to the campus. What kind of advice would you give to us about both the things that we have to absolutely make sure are in place in order for efforts like this to succeed, and also to be aware that as we go forward, there are going to be these challenges or these conditions that we're going to have to work through or address? So advice about what we need and advice about the problems that we need to anticipate in order to be able to continue the work.
Well, I'll start. To me, it's very simple. I think you need buy-in from many different departments, maybe not all, but you need buy-in from a number of social science and humanities departments. But most of all, you need commitment from administrators, from upper administrators at the university, because this is not something that can be done as a side project or something that's not going to take money. I know that particularly after COVID, universities are strapped for cash. And so if you want to do it on the cheap, and if, you know, every time you say, well, we're going to need this and we're going to need this, and you need 100% buy-in from upper administrators.
Yeah, and I just add, you need the buy-in, and we're back to resources, right? Our first commission started with no budget, right? We had no money, and to the president's credit, we got some money, and the current commission now has an annual budget, but this work would be unsustainable without actual resources. And I have not followed Deborah's sage advice about getting reimbursed for this work in any way. So I think that's also wise that it's Jim Campbell, who ran the Brown Project, reminds me all the time. This work is going to take a lot longer than you think it is, and it's going to take more resources than you initially think it's going to take. And so if you don't have that presidential level university buy-in and a commitment to fund it over some years, right? These are not year-long projects. And if you look at the schools that have been, clearly successful in this, they're multi-year projects, right? They go on for quite a long time.
So with that, we have reached time, but I think that gives us much to think about in terms of our efforts here and points to consider in relation to what has worked on your campuses. I want to thank the three of you. These were really, really wonderful contributions and reflections, and we hope to be in touch with you in relation to thinking about joining you in this work. Thank you so much, and please join me in thanking Deborah, Marisa, and Kirt for joining us for this panel. Thank you, everybody, also for coming. Take care. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.